On March 28, 1915, at the height of the First World War, a British ferry named the Brussels left Harwich for the neutral Dutch port of Rotterdam. Its skipper was 45-year-old Captain Charles Fryatt. He knew these waters well. It was his 143rd crossing of the war. A few hours into the voyage, Fryatt spotted a German submarine, U-33, off the starboard bow. U-boat captain Conrad Ganser signaled to the Brussels to stop. Ganser had been in command of U-33 for 5 months and was hungry for his first kill.
In 1915, the Germans began unrestricted submarine warfare. They unleashed their submarines to attack enemy and indeed neutral merchant ships in certain zones on site. They were allowed to torpedo them on site. This was an attempt to blockade Britain. The only way the Germans could. They couldn't defeat the Royal Navy on the surface, so they would use their U-boats as commerce raiders.
As far as merchant captains like Fryatt were concerned, their home waters were now a war zone. They could be attacked without warning. U-boats were earning a nasty reputation.
There were cases of people being picked up out of the water, put on the casing of a submarine, and the submarine would dive. Certain German captains were not really gentlemen, even if they weren't actually pirates.
Fryatt had only seconds to decide what to do about U-33. What he feared most was not her torpedoes, but her deck gun. He knew these guns had sunk scores of merchant ships. It was time to fight back.
U-33 had a 105mm gun on board, which carried 300 rounds of ammunition. That's compared to the 6 torpedoes it carried. Submarines didn't have a huge arsenal of torpedoes.
Captain Fryatt decided to eliminate the threat of the deck gun. He would ram U-33.
He ordered his engine room to put the engines at full steam ahead, and he steered the ship for the conning tower of the submarine. The German commander of the U-boat saw that he wasn't going to surrender, and he had to make a decision as quick as possible. And so he took a decision to dive.
Fryatt continued to steer directly for the spot where he saw the U-boat go down.
Some reports say that the periscope of the submarine was only 2 foot away from the side of the SS Brussels. Stokers down in the engine room, some of them made statements that they felt a bump and a scrape, almost as if he had hit something.
Although damaged, U-33 survived the encounter and went on to sink 40 merchant ships that year alone. The U-boat's effectiveness surprised even the Germans.
You could send them out into the western approaches. You could deploy them in the North Sea off British ports, and they proved to be, unexpectedly, a vitally important part of the First World War German Navy, perhaps the most important part in the end.
Despite the U-boat threat, Captain Fryatt continued his regular voyages across the Channel. But U-33's encounter with the Brussels wasn't forgotten by the Germans, as Fryatt would discover the following year. On the 22nd of June 1916, the Brussels was again sailing from Rotterdam to Tilbury.
Among the passengers were 100 or so Belgian refugees. However, according to the Germans, he had 50 escaped Russian prisoners of war.
Shortly after leaving Holland, he was surrounded by German torpedo boats. This time, he couldn't see any course of escape, and he was forced to take control of his ship on the instructions of the commander of the torpedo boats, and he was escorted to Belgium.
The Germans scuttled the Brussels and decided to try Captain Fryatt. The charge? Attempting to ram submarine U-33. The trial began at 2 p.m. on July 27, 1916. The verdict? Execution by firing squad. Fryatt was dead by sunset. Britain was outraged. Prime Minister Herbert Asquith declared in the House of Commons that Fryatt had been murdered by the Germans. On the Western Front, gunners wrote defiant messages on their shells before firing them towards enemy lines. U-33 succeeded in sinking a total of 84 ships in her career. But what about the wider U-boat campaign in the waters around the British Isles? Was it successful?
It was hoped that the ruthlessness of this attack would scare off neutral shipping and would so reduce British shipping that the British Empire would cease to be an operational thing. But there were too many ships, and shipping management was so effective, it did not give a decisive result.
Although the German U-boat campaign didn't bring Britain to its knees, it exposed the vulnerability of surface vessels to